right. I want to introduce our speaker today. Is Peter Schiff. He's a Republican running for the U.S. Senate seat, currently held by our own Christopher Dodd. Peter is one of 3 Republicans, I believe, running in the primary to which will be an open, obviously an open election. I believe in the state of Connecticut, you have to be registered to your party to vote in the primary, right? A Democrat has to be a registered Democrat to vote in that, and a Republican, right, has to be a registered Republican to vote in the primary. And with that, Peter, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Will you bust us? Did you register right in town here? Okay, you guys, after I finish speaking, everybody might want to take those happy dollars back. It's a pretty depressing, sobering year. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit about why I'm running for office and the state I think the country's in. I mean, first of all, you hear a lot of the news now that the economy is getting better, that the economy is improving, that people are spending money again, and that we're out of the woods. None of this is true. I mean, the people who think the economy is improving now, these are the same people who thought it was in great shape right up until the point when it completely collapsed. And the reason that they're still convinced that things are getting better is because they don't understand the nature of the problem. All we've done since the government started to stimulate the economy is we've gone deeper into debt. We've borrowed more money that we can't afford to repay, and we've bought more things that we don't need and we can't afford. And so we're now in a bigger hole than we were a year ago or 2 years ago, a much bigger hole, as a matter of fact. The problem is, as we're spending all that borrowed money, it makes the numbers look better, the GDP numbers or consumer spending, and we focus our attention there, and we ignore the other numbers that are getting worse, like our liabilities, how much money we owe, how many jobs we're destroying, how many businesses we're destroying. That's the real economy. The fact that we're spending other people's money and pretending the economy is growing, that's exactly what we did while the bubble was inflating. For all the years between 2002 and 2008, when everybody said it was a great economy, that was the problem. That was the bubble. It was a house of cards. That economy was based on borrowing money from the rest of the world and spending it. We as American citizens borrowed trillions of dollars. We bought all sorts of products from around the world. Our trade deficit went up to $60 billion a month. That's over, $700 billion a year, and our personal savings rate went negative. We were buying houses that we couldn't afford. We were overpaying for houses, and we were financing with all sorts of gimmick loans, and the government now is doing the same thing. I mean, the government was somewhat profligate during this period. The budget deficits weren't as big as they are now, but now they're off the charts. Now the government is borrowing like crazy. This most recent budget that Barack Obama proposed, and it's even hard to call the budget with a straight face because for every dollar we collect in taxes, we spend $1.60. But we've got a budget deficit of over $1.5 trillion. I mean, that is phenomenal. Meanwhile, the government is spending close to $4 trillion in 1 year. We didn't even spend $2 trillion. I think 2001 was the first time we got to $2 trillion. But we're actually spending double what we did in the year 2000. Double. The government is now twice as big. Right? And I remember, the year 2000. I remember thinking the government was pretty big back then. I'm sure a lot of people in this room thought we had too much government in the year 2000. We now have twice as much. Despite the fact that many people are actually earning less than they were 10 years ago. The stock market is a little bit lower than it was 10 years ago. A lot of houses are now back to where they were 10 years ago. How can the government be twice the size? How can the economy possibly sustain such an enormous government? And in fact, that is one of the reasons that the country is now in so much trouble. Because the government has now expanded to such a size that it's destroying everything else. Because it has to suck so much capital out of the private sector to sustain that level of savings that it's destroying businesses. People are worried that businesses aren't lending money, that the banks aren't lending money, that businesses can't get loans. Banks are lending money. They're lending a lot of money. The problem is they're lending it all to the government. They're buying treasury securities. That's loaning to the government. they're also making loans that are guaranteed by the government. When banks are making mortgages now, it's all government. The banks are loaning all their money to the government, and they're loaning money to government-insured entities. All the mortgages now are guaranteed by the government, every single one practically. 97% of all the mortgages now are government guaranteed. So when banks make a mortgage now, it's like buying treasuries. The government is also guaranteeing a lot of other types of debt, all the student loans now, and so there's no money left over for business, because why would they take a risk loaning to a business when they can take no risk loaning to the government or loaning to an entity where the government has guaranteed repayment? So there's no capital left for business. Meanwhile, we're not enabling the American economy to restructure. See, the problem was during the boom years, and it actually goes back a lot further, but particularly in the last decade or so, because of irresponsible monetary and fiscal policy, our economy went on a tangent that was unsustainable. Right? Interest rates were kept much too low by the Federal Reserve for too long. And as a result, we borrowed more money than we really should have. And very few people saved money. I mean, why would you save when you got nothing for doing it? And because of the asset bubbles that the Federal Reserve inflated in the stock and real estate market, people were speculating in those assets rather than saving. So we built up an economy where nobody saved, so we had to borrow from abroad. And nobody was making anything. We were just spending all this borrowed money. So we built up this service sector economy that is completely, it only can survive so long as the goods that we buy are shipped in from foreigners who make them, and they have to give them to us on credit. And that's unsustainable. You can't have an economy that's based on consumer spending, on consumer credit. Economies have to be based on savings. Economies can only grow when you have savings, because savings is where capital comes from. And capital is where businesses can invest and grow to provide goods and services and to create employment opportunities. Without savings, nothing happens. But our economy is a complete mess. When the real estate bubble finally burst, the economy was about to address these imbalances that have been building up over time. And the recession that commenced in late 2007 is actually the market's way of trying to cure the economy from the disease that the government inflicted it with. As painful as the recession is, the correct thing for the government to do is let it run its course. Don't try to interfere with government stimulus, because all that does is make it worse. That's exactly the mistake that we made with Greenspan and Bush when another bubble that the Federal Reserve inflated, the stock market bubble, burst. When that bubble burst, we had a lot of malinvestments, we funded a lot of crazy businesses, capital was misallocated during the 1990s. When the bubble burst, the market was going to reallocate labor and capital to more efficient areas. There was a recession. Instead of allowing the recession to run its course, we made the mistake of stimulating the economy. And it was that government stimulus, that cheap money, that inflated the housing bubble and simply postponed the consequences of the problem to a later date. Now, they did that because it helped get George Bush reelected, but the country suffered dramatically. Now, you have a very similar situation where an incoming president, Barack Obama, inherits the bursting of another asset bubble, and the government and the Federal Reserve are doing exactly what they did in 2002. They have learned nothing from their mistakes because they're repeating every one. Meanwhile, the free market is getting blamed for problems that were inherently created by government. If we actually had a free market, we wouldn't have had a housing bubble. The housing bubble was created by the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates much lower than the market would have set them, and by the moral hazards of government interference in the market. Fannie and Freddie were the biggest guarantors of mortgages. They guaranteed $6 trillion worth of mortgages. There's no way they could have guaranteed all that debt with hardly any capital if the government didn't stand behind them. And it was that government implied guarantee that enabled everything to happen. And all the securitized products on Wall Street, even the subprime market, and Fannie and Freddie didn't originate subprime, but they were the biggest buyers. But what made the subprime market tick was the teaser rate. The fact that you could borrow money, and for the first few years, you had a very low interest rate, or you can get an interest-only mortgage. That was all a gift of the Federal Reserve. If Alan Greenspan had irresponsibly lowered interest rates and kept them so low, the entire subprime market never could have been created. And I'm not just pointing this stuff out after the fact. Right? I was pointing it out as it was happening. I was a big critic of the Federal Reserve going back to 2002. The minute I saw what Alan Greenspan was doing, I knew what the